Biopiracy. It's a term used to describe the act of agribusiness corporations taking native farming knowledge to create genetically modified crops. Activists allege that such acts are destroying the livelihoods of small farmers and posing a threat to biodiversity. They also claim that agribusiness giants like the Monsanto company are using patents to monopolize the food supply. Take a look at this clip from a video with Indian environmental activist Vandana Shiva. And before I show that to you, I want to point out what's on my screen is basically a product called BT brindle, and we're going to be discussing it. It's a very controversial type of eggplant. But let's take a look at what Vandana Shiva has to say here. She's making an interesting commentary now using the concept of open source software as an analogy to explain why seeds for farmers need to be kept patent-free. Let's take a look.
Open source is like open seeds. Open pollinated variety seeds are made through pollination of bees and butterflies acting in freedom. They are free in the sense they can be saved generation after generation. They are seeds of prosperity, they're seeds of life. Open source software is the same. It is a way of spreading prosperity and knowledge in society rather than creating scarcity, poverty, and deprivation.
Now, a developing case in India could make it the first government to take legal action against a multinational corporation for alleged biopiracy. Here to explain the situation via Skype from Bangalore is Leo Saldana of the Environment Support Group, an Indian NGO that has been calling on the government to press charges against Monsanto. Leo, thank you so much for joining us. We want to know quickly, Monsanto has denied that it produces BT brinjal, and that it's basically that this product is produced by another company. So why are you including them or pressing for them to be included in the suit?
Well, that's Monsanto's lie. The truth is that Monsanto bought in 33% into Mahiko, which is an Indian company, and thus its subsidiary is the one which is promoting both BT cotton, which is the first GMO product, not a food product, but BT brinjal, BT eggplant, as is worldwide known, is a product which Monsanto and Mahiko jointly developed. And it's not just them. The USAID supported them in doing that.
Now, I want to, before we go any further, we did request an appearance by a representative from Monsanto, but unfortunately they declined to appear. However, they did send us the following statement. Monsanto has not received any such information regarding India's plans to file charges that Monsanto violated the country's biodiversity laws over genetically modified version of eggplant. They want to reiterate that reports suggesting that BT brinjal is produced by Monsanto and/or in partnership with Mahiko are untrue and not based on facts. They go further to state that we understand Mahiko has independently conducted BT brinjal research for over 9 years in full compliance with the guidelines and directives of the regulatory authorities to ensure its safety, making BT brinjal the most rigorously tested vegetable with 25 environmental biosafety studies. How do you respond to that?
Well, first and foremost, one must be clear that the Monsanto person who wrote this is obviously not reading the news, at least not news emerging from India. The Minister of Environment, Jayanti Natarajan, made several statements in Parliament last year, stating very clearly Monsanto and Mahiko have violated India's Biological Diversity Act, and that the National Biodiversity Authority, which is a regulator, will prosecute them. I don't see why they don't get what we are saying to them, or they probably deliberately want to be ignorant. The other part about Mahiko having done so much research, that is a very controversy which led us to have a moratorium imposed last February, about a year ago, and following about 6 very, very well-attended public consultations across the country. And this moratorium was imposed by the union government because it felt that it was not, there was not enough studies done to understand the health and environmental implications, and all the claims that the company made along with its collaborators simply did not stand the scientific rigor that is required for pushing India's first GMO into the market.
So let me jump in there because I actually want to show a clip, and Glenn, I want to get your thoughts on this because from Monsanto's perspective, they believe that this is indeed improving the lives of farmers. This is an example of a woman, Rosalie Elasus, in the Philippines who uses a genetically modified brand of corn. Let's take a look.
If I will have to choose an innovation or technology in my farming, I am proud to say, I should say, it should be a biotechnology crops or the biotech corn that I am using now. I saw a big difference. It was amazing actually, because this BT corn was so clean and so healthy, and the leaves are so green. There is no infestation of corn borer. The benefit that I gained from BT corn is really needed not only here in the Philippines, but all around the world.
So let me ask you about this, Glenn. I mean, she shows that corn. It's very big. It looks very yellow. It's physically seems quite attractive. Is there not some truth to the argument that certain farmers are benefiting from the introduction of these crops?
Well, it's actually harder to measure than you would think. I mean, she's there in the Philippines. There actually was research that was done comparing how the BT maize did as compared to non-BT maize. And the data showed that the BT maize was yielding somewhat more than the conventional maize. The problem is, it was also the case that the farmers who had adopted BT maize were wealthier farmers, they had bigger farms, they were more educated, they had more tractors. Mm-hmm. So you would almost expect them to be getting somewhat higher yields, and they did.
And why is it? Why did they adopt it? Is it that they were the ones who were approached to adopt it? Is that they chose to get it? How do these crops become integrated into the farming cultures?
Well, it's not really, it's complicated. Part of it is that the BT crops oftentimes cost more, sometimes a lot more, sometimes a little bit more. And so that means it's more attractive to farmers who have got more money. The second thing is that it's slightly risky. It's something you've never grown before. It's a new kind of crop, and so it's attractive to the kinds of farmers who can take more risk. So those tend to be the bigger, more prosperous ones.
Got you. Let's go to our community.
Well, many people in our community, perhaps unsurprisingly, are very critical of Monsanto. Let's listen in first to Steen Kirby and what he thinks.
My name is Steen Kirby from Atlanta, Georgia. Just to comment about Monsanto and GMO. Monsanto is an evil corporation. They bribe and bully other governments into accepting the genetically modified crops in order to make money. It ruins our food supply. It causes a lot of farming issues. It's just a total disaster and it needs to be shut down.
So he calls them evil. He says it's ruining the food supply. And then, you know, we have many people on Twitter echoing this. Darwin Reject saying it's killed copious amounts of people, including my uncle, brain cancer Agent Orange, with little to no culpability. Then a tweet from Mira Mirage saying, yes, I believe Monsanto's the most evil corporation in existence today. You know, the tweets go on, but then we also have people like Jasmeet Singh saying biotech corporations are not trying to monopolize the world's food supply, they're tackling with the growing population agenda. So where is the balance on this, Leo? Which is it?
Well, if you look at the Indian example, I heard Glenn earlier say that, you know, we don't have the evidence to connect the mass deaths of farmers. 200,000 plus farmers have killed themselves over the past decade with the fact that GMO has been introduced through cotton. But, you know, the national crime statistics came out last year, and what it reveals is most of the farmers who kill themselves are the small and medium farmers. It is not just the large farmers who go into the GMO type of crop. The small and medium farmers also go in, and they're heavily induced into this because of the type of banking network and the type of loans which are extended, which are totally unaffordable loans. And within a couple of seasons, and at best 3 or 4 seasons, they find themselves totally broke. Now, we have been farming for thousands of years in this country. Never before in the history of this country have farmers killed themselves. We have seen enormously long droughts, and we have survived that. We have a very resilient farming community. How is it in the past decade, when all these multinational corporations have stepped in and expanded their, sort of empire, if I may use that, why is it farmers are killing themselves all of a sudden? So I think there's a pattern that we see here. And this pattern is very frightening because we also see that there's a very, very large-scale migration out of farms in India. And this is because of the distress in farming. And this is being written about, spoken about, but it's simply not enough yet to tackle the type of mindset which the world has, that this type of big farming is the only way forward. Because there are also studies which we have recently got in India where it shows that, if you just did organic farming, in say 7 to 8 years, you seem to be having greater productivity than if you had gone for the other type of farming.
Now, I want to
so
bring
there
up
are
an interesting point here, Leo, because just for the purposes of our audience having clarity, we have a visual on my screen, and we've tweeted it out, that talks about what is a genetically modified organism. And I want to point out a couple of things. One, on the left, says that a GMO is the direct human manipulation of an organism's DNA in a laboratory environment. A GMO is not plants and animals that are traditionally bred to achieve specific characteristics such as breeding dogs or cross-pollination of plants. So basically, the law does not allow for the patenting of existing life forms. However, if you combine, it says that cross-species or transgenic genetic manipulation that leads to a new form of life or genetically modified organism can be patented. So I want to come to you, Leo, first, and then get your thoughts on this. Glenn, what is the implication of allowing for living organisms to be patented?
That's me first?
Yes, you first, Leo.
I want to take you to a policy of Monsanto. It's on their website. The question they ask is, why does Monsanto sue farmers? And they claim they sue farmers because they want to protect farmers' interests. Now, it's a kind of a contradiction which I simply cannot wrap my head around. They go on to justify that if you were provided patents for the products that private companies develop, only then can you develop better products. My sense of agriculture and life forms is that if you were to actually allow nature to work, it works wonders. If you take a genetic material from a foreign organism, in this case, in the BT brinjal case, it is from a bacteria, and you're inserting it into a food which is widely consumed across this country, and you don't know the implications of that. And the long-term implications are, when we don't know the short-term implications, how are we going to predict the long-term implications? Mm-hmm. So basically, I think we have to use what is known as, in law, the precautionary approach. If you don't know enough in science, I don't think we should risk future generations and current generations because of the type of market-based interventions that companies are willing to make.
Okay, so Glenn, let me bring this to you because I did find that clip that Leo mentioned. It's right here on the Monsanto website, and it says, why does Monsanto sue farmers who save seeds? And the argument that they're making is that the farmers who purchase a patented seed variety sign an agreement that they won't save and replant the seeds, and they're saying that the vast majority of farmers understand and appreciate the research and are willing to pay for our inventions and the value they provide. They don't think it's fair that some farmers don't pay. Now, the argument that's being raised is that, well, actually, these companies like Monsanto are actually drawing from the indigenous knowledge that these farmers have generated over decades and generations, and that have normally been open sourced, as Vandana Shiva said. So what is the tension here, and what are some of the ethical considerations when a company is claiming to have a sense of ownership over knowledge that the indigenous people claim they've cultivated for generations?
Well, in the first place, they're drawing on more than just indigenous knowledge. They're also drawing on research that's paid for by our tax dollars, where most of the genetically modified crops incorporate technologies that were developed with public funding. You and I pay taxes, it goes to the National Science Foundation, that supports research, which then gets sold off typically from universities to corporations, who then end up with patents on the crops. So they're drawing on a lot there. And secondly, this issue of patents, I agree with Leo, there are some major problems with signing patents to genes and to plants. And the one thing that he didn't mention, but which is worth thinking about, is that, a patent is a really strong form of intellectual property. It means that if I've got a patent on something, I can keep you from owning it, from making it, or selling it. Which means that if I've got a crop, I can keep you from doing research on the crop to find out if it is impacting ecosystems. And in fact, that does happen. So a lot of us think that there has to be some form of intellectual property protection for crops, but to give them patents, I think, was probably an enormous judicial blunder.
And well, let's get some more comments from our audience, because there's a lot coming in for them.
Yeah, it's true. And Derek, to be honest, there are many different threads, many different themes that people are debating around. Let's take one of them here. Tokun Bo Bidemi on Twitter says, if such firms want to indeed feed and better the world, then, quote, biotech piracy laws wouldn't be this stringent or selfish, rather. And many people are touching on this selfish idea, saying Alleluia on Twitter, saying he's not for legitimizing or normalizing this, but the profits of it will not be distributed to the indigenous populations. And then let's listen to this video comment that came in from Bethany Shanice.
I'm Bethany from Rutgers University in New Jersey in the U.S. Although biodiversity and the copyrighting of genes is very important and worrying, farmers in the developing world have largely been left out of this debate. Crops that are vitamin enriched and very hardy will do wonders for income and the lifestyle of these farmers.
So she seems to contradict herself, saying enriched seeds could do wonders, but at the same time, the point that I think is interesting is that she says the farmers are left out of these conversations. What do you make of that? Is that really what the problem is here?
Yeah, I think a lot of farmers are pretty much sidelined in a lot of these conversations. And it's quite true that with intellectual property protection like patents on genes and on crops, then it makes a lot of farmers very vulnerable to being pursued by the companies that actually own these.
Right.
And it's not just a matter of, we were talking earlier about farmers not being willing to pay. Yeah. In fact, there are some farmers who whose fields were contaminated by genetically modified crops. Mm-hmm. And so it's not a matter of them not being willing to pay. He didn't even want the genes in his field in the first place.
You're talking about the natural process of cross-pollination. You know, bees and butterflies will fly from one farm to the next farm because they don't know borders. Yeah. And so that pollination could happen, and basically someone's farm could potentially, someone could become liable for...
Yeah, that's happened. It was actually probably trucks going on the road, down the road that had crops in it, and it blew off. Mm-hmm. But the famous case here is this farmer in Canada named Percy Schmeiser, who didn't buy and didn't intend to plant Monsanto's genetically modified canola, was his crop, which is a kind of oil seed. Mm-hmm. But it turns out that it was in his field, and he was replanting it, and he was sued by Monsanto for violating their patent. And his argument was, but it's actually a case of contamination. This stuff blew into my field.
Yeah.
And there were two court cases. The big one over the patent went to the Supreme Court, and he lost that in a very close decision. Mm-hmm. He was infringing their patent. There was secondly an environmental court case, and they found for him. He said, my field's been contaminated. The court said it has been contaminated, and Monsanto had to pay him a small amount of money. So it actually was contamination.
This is fascinating. Leo, talk to us a little bit about the 2004 International Seed Treaty. Apparently this was supposed to protect the rights of farmers. How has it worked out?
Well, I think it has worked the other way around, because the farmers' interest has largely not been protected at all in India, despite all this. And what we find is, since 2004, there is a greater rush of foreign transnational corporations into India. And when we started researching our biopiracy case against Monsanto, we found that they were the first of many who have violated the biodiversity laws of this country, and also the Convention on Biological Diversity. It seems to us that these guys just don't care about international law and sovereignty of states. They just come in, they have their product, they want collaborators, they get their governments to finance their research, and then they say, look, we do it for your good, so that you guys come out of your poverty. We are not a basket case. We are not charity. We are not begging for charity. This is a region which has probably contributed tremendously for, the wonderful agriculture that the world has produced.
So on that point, Leo, I want to take that conversation about what is the international business and governmental factors at play. Why does a company like Monsanto have such sway in the international arena? And we're going to carry that into our post show. Before we do that, I want to go to Ahmed for some of the leads that the stream is currently following.
Our first lead is from the Ivory Coast, where a rally held by supporters of the Popular Front Party led by former President Laurent Gbagbo was attacked. This video shows hundreds of people chanting and dancing at first, but the rally then turned violent when intruders began to throw rocks and tear gas canisters at supporters. Gbagbo is currently at The Hague awaiting trial for crimes against humanity. Now, our next lead comes from the U.S., where activists disrupted an important forum for the energy industry in an attempt to challenge, quote, big oil lobbying. Let's take a listen.
Mr. President, what are you thinking?
Now, in the video, Jack Gerard, president of the American Petroleum Institute, slams the Obama administration for rejecting the proposed Keystone XL pipeline in his speech when activists, as you can hear right there, interrupted him and shouted "fact check," reminiscent of the Occupy movement's mic check. Now, our final lead is from Lebanon, where a Beirut-based social media agency has been keeping track of what Lebanese politicians are saying on Twitter. An analysis of former Lebanese Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri reveals that 86% of his tweets focus on politics. Now, you can follow these stories on stream.aljazeera.com/leads and find out more about them. Derek?
Thank you, Ahmed. Glenn and Leo, stay with us. We're carrying the conversation into the post show. We're talking about the international influence of the Monsanto Corporation and these questions about biopiracy. On Tuesday, unrest in Somalia and how the Somali diaspora is giving back to their homeland. Tweet us at AJStream. We will see you at stream.aljazeera.com right now for the post show. Hi, welcome to the post show. We're going to continue our conversation about the concept and the controversy around the idea of biopiracy. Glenn, I want to come to you. We know that this is not just an issue that has been raised in India, and you gave the example of Canada. Talk to us a little bit more about some of the different areas where these issues have been coming up.
Well, I think the first thing is that genetically modified crops are overwhelmingly a U.S. phenomenon. If you look at a chart of where they're planted, we completely dominate. Then the next two countries on the list in terms of how many acres are planted to GM crops are Brazil and Argentina. And so people talk about how these crops are important for small farmers in developing countries, but actually the great majority, the overwhelming majority of the farmers in Brazil and Argentina that are planting these crops are big capitalized farms, and they're planting commodity soybeans, which are sold off to China to feed animals for the most part. So only after that do you get down to India, which is the number 4 on the list, and that's the only country where you really have a significant number of small farmers growing them.
Well, we also know that a number of countries have banned them. It seems that 30 countries have bans or restrictions on GMOs, and according to this platform, it's saying because they're not considered proven safe. Leo, talk to us a little bit about this. They are allowed to be planted in the India by the Indian government. So what kind of studies have been done about the relative safety of genetically modified organisms? Mustn't there be some sense that they are safe if the government gave approval in the first place?
Now, first, I think we should be clear that the government has not approved the release of India's first food GMO, which is BT brinjal. What we're talking about is BT cotton, which was introduced in the late 90s. And it has now capitalized about 90–95% of the cotton trade in India. So talking about food GMO, the approval was given by the regulatory agencies in 2009. It was found to be both fraudulent and insufficient. And the then minister, Jairam Ramesh, reacting to public pressure, said, let's go and find out what the people of India think. And he held 6 or 7 public consultations, which are attended by thousands of farmers. We talked a little earlier about how farmers are marginalized from this debate, and he acknowledged it. And he said, let me understand what it means when we talk to farmers. And when people came out in thousands across India, they were basically saying, look, we know how to grow food crops. We would like improved varieties, but we do not want GMO. And this led to a fantastic debate across the country where scientists from all sorts of streams came in, doctors came out, people from across the world contributed to this debate. And essentially it was found that the type of field trials that they had undertaken and the kind of tests that they had put to, particularly the tests on human health, were totally insufficient. In fact, there were serious doubts that it could cause all sorts of problems to human health. And there were, it's simply not possible to understand how a human organism interacts with a new organism, which BT brinjal is. It is not brinjal, it is BT brinjal. It's a totally different organism. The fact that it has got a foreign gene from a bacteria which otherwise does not normally get into the human system is a very, very serious intervention. And this needs to be understood more like how pharmaceutical companies test drugs. Brinjal, for instance, it's about, if you take all the vegetables grown, about 10% of the production of vegetables is brinjal. It's grown on 8% of the, in terms of the vegetables grown, in terms of land mass occupied by vegetables, 8% of that is by brinjal. So it's a very heavily consumed vegetable. So, and it's also extremely accessible by the poor. And if you were to try and put BT brinjal on the market in a country where regulation normally doesn't work, one cannot distinguish what is a genetically modified organism from one that is not. And so people will, be consuming something that they don't know is a foreign organism, has got a foreign organism inside it.
Let's get
So
Glenn's thoughts on this. I want to draw you in.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm a little bit less concerned about the health impacts of BT brinjal, but one thing I'm very concerned about is the amount that scientists have been able to find out about outcrossing. In other words, the BT brinjal sends its pollen out and it can cross with other, either a brinjal, that is other eggplant that's being cultivated, or wild eggplants. And there are dozens of wild eggplants which are not eaten in food, but they're used in medicine, including in Ayurvedic medicine. And this was one of the things that came up in the whole consultation process that Leo was talking about, that Jayam Ramesh got some input from international scientists, and some of them who were leading authorities on gene flow, on this outcrossing process, had said that they thought that the data were actually very insufficient. We really don't know the extent to which this BT brinjal might send its genes out to cross with other wild brinjals. And so there's a huge question there.
You know, I actually have a question that just comes to my mind before we get back to the audience. So let's say you create something like BT brinjal, and it is, as Leo mentioned, it's a food crop as opposed to, and that's a very important distinction, a commercial crop like cotton. Who tests it? Who eats it? How do they determine it's safe?
Well, in most countries, the tests are done by the company. Because otherwise you would have this huge burden of the government having to test all the things that were coming forward. A lot of people find that a little bit worrisome, but the tests are mainly done by the company that is actually that's actually trying to bring it forward. In this case, with the BT brinjal, some studies were sponsored by the government just because it was a very special case. It would be India's first genetically modified food. But for the most part, and in this country, the overwhelming majority of the tests are done by the company itself that's trying to get it commercialized.
So the company tests the food and declares that it's safe, and therefore it's allowed on the market?
Well, the company tests it and it then submits its results. And in some cases, the results have to be submitted and approved by, for instance, the Environmental Protection Agency. In the case of data that have to go to the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S., that's actually voluntary. So it happens, but it doesn't actually have to happen. The first food crop that we had in this country was a tomato called the Flavor Savor tomato, genetically modified, and released in 1994. And they did some very careful tests on its health impacts, but it was all voluntary.
Interesting.
And so it was approved by the FDA, but the FDA didn't have to approve it.
Got you. Let's go to our audience. Ahmed?
Yeah, you know, it's funny, Derek. Our audience is pretty much in sync with the conversation. As you can see, Sarah Rashid saying we still don't know all side effects of genetically modified food. Countries should focus, therefore, on natural food production. But Leo, something that I want to put to you that came in, Shuja Rabbani saying, we've reached a world population of 7+ billion and we'll need to find ways to feed everyone. Many are already starving, and Abidun Ajayi says, I just don't understand the reasons, therefore, for the fears for GMO. It's the way out of hunger with skyrocketing world population. Do you see that point? And do you understand it?
Well, our research in India shows that the contrary is true because it takes much more fertilizer input to keep these GMO crops going. Many states which are heavily into GMO cotton have realized that there's a very, very high induction of fertilizers. And fertilizers actually make farmers farming less profitable. So I don't think going the GMO way is going to help us end world hunger. Certainly not. And most importantly, most Indian farmers and most of the farmers across the world are subsistence farmers. That must be acknowledged. They're not large farms like in the United States. These farmers go into multi-crops. When a company comes in with its product, it tries to erase this fantastic diversity and fantastic culture of agriculture, where people learn to live on their own and not really depend on the market, not really depend on governments. Now, you don't want to take that away. You want to build on that. That is the type of challenge that we have in our kind of crisis the planet is going through right now.
Leo, you mentioned the government and markets. Talk to us a little bit about how a company like Monsanto can have influence over both markets and governments in order to promote these kinds of products.
Well, first, in terms of how it influences government, I think they lobby a lot. If you look at the Indian BT brinjal example, most of the people who were sitting inside the regulatory agencies were people who were promoting GMO. They were not independent. They were people who wanted GMOs to come in. Now, that's the kind of mechanism that allows a company like Monsanto to walk into India. When that was exposed, the government was embarrassed, and it came up with a proposal and said, let's ask the academy, the science academies of India. 6 or 7 were chosen. You know what they did? They just grabbed information from the internet, did not cite it, and just produced a report basically praising Monsanto. Now, that's the kind of power that a company like this has on both bureaucracy as well as the scientific community. When it comes to the market, I guess, it's just money that talks, and Monsanto has lots of it. It's a company which spends heavily on suing small farmers. And they've won each and every one of those cases. Now, they're just going to do the same thing everywhere they go. And I have recently learned that Monsanto's first major outside of the United States, the first company that they have registered is India, and it's called Monsanto Holdings. So they're long-term players. They're not short-term players. We must acknowledge that, and they're cash-rich companies.
Well, I want to get Glenn in on this. What's your take?
Well, one of the things we were talking about a second ago is this problem of how many hungry people there are and whether or not GMOs aren't needed in order to try to feed them. And India is a great country to think about in terms of dealing with that question, because India has got more hungry people than any other country in the world by far. There's not even a close second. And India also has this huge problem that I'm sure Leo knows about with the buffer stocks, which are government granaries filled with hundreds of millions of tons of wheat and rice. And they have got way more in the buffer stocks than they can keep, way more than they actually want. And the numbers have fluctuated over the past 10 years between 40 and 30 million tons over what they actually can keep in the buffer stocks. So in some ways of looking at it, India has got too much food. There's no country in the world that makes it clearer that there's no relationship whatsoever between absolute food shortage and hunger.
So why is there such hunger, widespread hunger in India, if they have an overstock of food?
Because people are really poor. It's the same reason that you have hunger everywhere, because people are poor and people are not entitled to the food. It's the same thing we had with the Irish potato famine, which we all learn about, where how many 2 million Irish people starved. And Ireland was increasing its food exports throughout the potato famine. We see this over and over again. People are very poor in India. The buffer stocks are not designed to feed everyone. There's some corruption there, and there's some inefficiency, and even when the food actually does get out to the villages, a lot of people just don't have the money to buy it. So there's a poverty problem. There's not an absolute food supply problem.
Well, we've got a very interesting tweet from @BCatDC talking about a distinction in this, and it says that there are 2 very separate issues here. One is whether we should play God with genetic code. Another is whether genetic codes can be owned. And I think that is the fundamental question that needs to be answered. Leo, Glenn, I want to thank you both for being here. Ahmed, thank you so much for getting our community involved. And thank you for being with us. Remember, you can continue the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag AJStream, or check us out at facebook.com/AJStream. As always, we will see you online.